A sewing lesson from Sew New York. Today we're going to discuss fabrics and grain and so much more.
Hi, welcome to Sew New York. I'm McCracken. Today we're going to have a discussion on sewing fabrics. This is a great lesson for those of you who are totally new to sewing, or even if you have just a little bit of experience, you might want to understand woven fabrics. We're going to look at 3 different fabrics today. We're not going to be talking about knits or non-wovens. This is strictly woven fabric, and we're going to take a look at direction. Direction is a very important topic for understanding which way your pattern should lay on the fabric. So we're going to talk about straight grain, selvage, cross grain, the width of the fabric, the length of the fabric, as well as we'll talk about bias, and I'm going to get a little bit into weaving so you understand how a woven fabric is made.
So first of all, I think we should cover a little bit about weaving so that you understand what a woven fabric is. And right now, I am also a weaver, and many years ago, I made this. This is a carpet. You're only looking at a portion of it. And I'm using this for the lesson today because the yarns that made it are quite large, and you can see them. So you'll be able to see, I'm going to give you some close-up shots. You'll be able to see the direction of this fabric. It's a carpet, so it's carpet fabric. Okay, so we're going to talk about, the first thing we're going to talk about is warp. Warp, and these terms don't really pertain to sewing, but they do pertain to weaving, and then it will help to give you a better understanding of woven fabric. So warp are all the yarns that run in this direction, which is the length of your fabric. Those are your warp yarns. They run in the length, all right? And all the yarns that run across are called the weft. So warp is W-A-R-P and weft is W-E-F-T. It's important to know these terms even if you're not weaving fabric, because this is again about direction. So all the yarns that go this way are weft, and the weft yarns are your cross grain, or the width of your fabric. The warp yarns that run this way run in the length, and the length of the fabric is the straight grain of the fabric. And the straight grain of your fabric is the strongest direction. This is the strongest direction. It's much stronger than going this way. Okay? So that's important to know, because whenever you lay a pattern down, you're going to lay it in the warp direction, the straight grain direction. Okay, this is a closer look at the size of the yarn for the carpet, and it's fairly large. And it's close up so you can see each individual. Here's a black yarn, this is gold, this is a cream color, here's some more black yarns, here's red, and those yarns are pretty large. And if you look down here, you can see this is the fringe at the end of the carpet, and you can see each yarn. So they're nice and large. And the reason I want you to see these is because it's much easier to understand a woven fabric by looking at this carpet, because this carpet is really no different than a piece of any other piece of woven fabric that you might sew with. Here are 3 other pieces of fabric. I have a piece of muslin right here. I have a piece of silk charmeuse. This light blue is silk charmeuse, and this is a cotton fabric. This is more like a fabric you might use in your kitchen and to make curtains. It's not heavy, but it's heavier than the silk. You could make a tote bag out of this. It's an arrangement of fruit. And I'm showing you all 3 of these because these are all basically woven in the same fashion that this heavy carpet was made. So you understand the direction, all these yarns going down and all these yarns going across. The same thing is happening, even though this is a really fine piece of silk. It's silk charmeuse, and it's very, very thin. I'm going to come in close on this, and you'll see that you really can't see each yarn because they're so fine. Okay, here's a close-up of the silk charmeuse. You can see a little bit of the yarns, but you can't really see the individual fine yarns that make up the silk. So the idea, though, is that this fabric is comprised of two directions, the straight grain and the cross grain. We'll take a little bit better look at this in a minute. I'm going to show you the two other fabrics just so you can get an idea of how fine woven fabrics can be, all done with yarns, just like the carpet. And here is a close-up of the muslin. This piece, the white fabric here, it's not really white, this beige fabric, and our cotton print. And you can see the fine little threads, okay? And these are both woven in the same fashion that the carpet was woven, in two directions. Okay, now we're looking at the silk charmeuse. I have it opened up and it's just sort of very fluid looking, and it's laying here for us to take a look at direction again. So now that we know what warp and weft is the straight grain, weft is the cross grain. We're going to forget about warp and weft because those are weavers' terms. But we're going to talk about straight grain and cross grain. And one other very important word is going to come into play that's very important for sewers. So right now, you can't see it because I used the carpet before, it's very fine. Right now I'm holding this edge of fabric. Let me lay that down again. This edge right here. This is our straight grain of fabric, this direction. This is the length. So there's a couple of yards of fabric here, and when I went to the store and purchased it, they cut it for me. They measured from the beginning here this way. They measured 2 yards in this direction, in the length of the fabric, not in the width, which is the cross grain. That's what goes in this direction. They did not measure this way. That would be the wrong way. Now what happens when you have your straight grain? There's a term called the selvage, and that's very important to the new sewer. This is where, I know it looks like it's fraying along here, this is the finished edge of the fabric. This is where the cross grain yarns wrap around the straight grain yarns. So all the yarns that go in the width, the cross grain, this way, when they get to the end, they wrap around the straight grain yarns, and it creates a finished edge. The finished edge is the selvage. So again, now we're looking at the selvage on the carpet. You can see the cross grain wrapping around the straight grain. That's a nice finished edge. The selvage. Again, here's our silk. This is our length of the fabric. This is the straight grain. This is where all the yarns run in the length. And down here is where all the yarns run in the width of the fabric, this way, cross grain, okay? Straight grain is the strongest grain, and cross grain is weaker, okay? Last but not least, I want to talk to you about one more fabric term with woven fabrics. So you see again, here's the selvage, the straight grain. Wovens do not stretch, whereas knits do. So if I take this, there's no stretch in this direction, okay? And this is the cross grain, and there's no stretch there either. It's a woven fabric, and they don't stretch. But way back before we had knits, which stretch in both directions in some cases, we just had the wovens, and there was what was called bias cut garments, which meant they were cut on the bias. And bias is this. If I fold the fabric at a 90-degree angle, okay, here's the 90-degree angle, and that way, both this and this way. Then over here, this fabric now has a lot of stretch. So it's very difficult to make a bias cut garment. It's not easy. This would become my straight grain. It's on an angle. This is the normal straight grain, and this is the cross grain. This direction would be come the straight grain. So I would lay my... Now the reason that you need to know your straight grain and the selvage, because this is the direction of the fabric that you want to lay your pattern down. So if you were making a skirt pattern, you would lay the pattern in the length. I'm going to get a pattern piece and show you what I mean. Right now you're looking at the front piece, the front pattern piece of a pencil skirt. The pattern piece is pinned on the fold. I'll explain. So this edge over here, all the way along there, is the fold. And that fold is parallel with your selvage, which is the finished edge that's running right straight down along here. I'm going to come in closer and show it to you in a second, but I want you to understand. So this is your straight grain. This is your cross grain. The pattern is laying on the straight grain. So the waistline is here, and so you understand, the hem is down here, or the bottom of the skirt. So that's laying on straight grain. And there's always a grain line on your pattern, except for pieces that go on the fold. This one is on the fold, and there's no grain line on the pattern piece. What you need to understand is that the fold is parallel with the selvage. Here we have a closer view of the pattern piece laying on the silk. And again, over here you see that this edge is the fold of the fabric. I'm going to show it to you. That's the fold. And over here, this is the selvage. Right through here. This is the selvage of the fabric. And what I've done, I folded the fabric in half. When you have a piece of fabric that you've bought, it comes in a width. There are two selvages, and I have it opened up from one side to the other, all the way over to the selvage over here. So there's always two selvages. Typically, we fold it in half. So I folded the two selvages together. The two opposite selvages are together, and therefore we have a fold on this edge. So the fold is now parallel with your selvage, and this is your straight grain going all the way down. Okay, once it's on the fold and the very edge, the pattern piece tells you to pin it on the fold. So for this pattern piece, when I cut it out, I'm cutting 2 layers with a fold, and when you open it up, you have the right and left side of the front of the skirt. The fold is always parallel with the selvage, and therefore it is straight. That's straight grain. This is the most typical way of folding your fabric when you're laying pattern pieces out. There are other methods. Let's talk about one more thing with fabric. When you're buying a woven fabric, it comes in widths. And generally on the back of your pattern, your commercial patterns that you buy, you'll see 2 width ranges provided and how much fabric you should buy for the width. So it might say it's for a 60-inch width fabric, and that really means fabrics that range from about 58 inches to about 62 inches. You're going to need less of that fabric because it's wider. And then there's a range of fabric size that's 45 inches wide. 45-inch width fabric could be anything from, say, 42 to about 48 inches. And typically you'll need more when it's more narrow. So look at the back of your pattern, and the pattern will tell you how much fabric you'll need. Years ago, they used to make fabric 36 inches wide as well. Well, that's about it for today. See you at the next lesson.